It's a privilege to host this panel with our distinguished ministers. And I will really only play the role of facilitating this conversation. But I took a to-do for this panel in many ways. Minister Rania, you already said COP27 will be about implementation. So if I push you a little bit towards that, that's just to set the tone for that. But Lord Stern just gave us a to-do list too. He said we only need a full domestic policy, country platforms. We actually need 4 risks to be managed. Exchange rate risk, credit risk, political risk, sector risk, and so on. And then the most efficient way to do that would be with blended finance, at least to make a step, as has been discussed. We saw the examples of Joan in the village and the numbers that we have been discussing. So as an opening question to you both, I just wanted to ask you to remind us, why are the PPPs so important? Why are we actually here? And then with that, we can deepen it further. Maybe, Ms. Rania, have you start?
Well, thank you very much. First, I just want to say I'm very honored and happy to be with Minister Tharman here on stage, being one of his followers over many years. Public-private partnerships are extremely important. The experiment has shown us, and the experience has shown us, that governments on their own cannot do it, even if they try to. They have to create enabling environments to invite the private sector. And we are here today to discuss how can that be possible. When we say that this is a COP of implementation, we saw that one of the key outcomes of Glasgow was that we went from billions to trillions. We had private sector coming together, GFANZ coming together and saying, we want to be part of this net zero transition. We have capital and we want to go into countries. But then, as Lord Stern mentioned, there are several risks which impede this capital from going into the countries that need it the most. So public-private partnerships are supposed to help us bridge that gap. Governments have a role to play. Private sector has a role to play. MDBs, as we saw through concessional, have a role to play. Philanthropy, which is coming in very forcefully, need to be given the floor or paving the way for that capital to make it, to increase maybe the grant component at the beginning that would create investable projects. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rania, and I think we've had a set of very clear presentations. I'll just add 2 points. First, Nick Stern spoke about urgency and scale. We have a 50-50 chance of reaching 1.5 degrees in the next 5 years. And what's important is that it's not just part of a linear trajectory where you reach 1.5 and it takes you closer to 2.4 and so on. It has impact on tipping points, because all along the way, you have tipping points. What happens in the permafrost in Alaska and large parts of Russia, how the impact of breaching tipping points impacts on other tipping points. So we really have tipping points cascading into other tipping points, and we now are at risk of exponential changes in ways that are very hard for McKinsey to model, for the best climate scientists to model. In fact, even what's happening this year, the very unusually extreme heat waves, droughts, floods, sometimes even in neighboring regions, was not anticipated by the scientists. It's much worse. The intensity and scale of extreme weather events has not been anticipated. So we really have to recognize the urgency of acting now, because it's actually not about 2050, let alone 2100. It's about the tipping points that are already being breached. Scale. Dr. Rania spoke about scale and how it inherently requires private, public, and philanthropic. There are 2 points to highlight here. First, actual and perceived risk in investments in the emerging markets and developing economies is too high. The hurdle rates are too high. They're too high for companies to afford. And if you can't offer a very high risk-adjusted return to private investors, you don't get the money. So the task of the public sector, national, regional, and multilateral, is to reduce that excessive risk premium. And I say excessive because a fair bit of it is based on perceptions and the fact that we're not organizing ourselves to reduce risk. It's not due to inherent risk. Some of it is due to inherent risk, the actual risks that need to be tackled and mitigated. But some of it is just the fact that we're not organizing ourselves to pool risks and to apportion it better. If we can reduce the risk of investment in emerging market and developing economies by even 30%, it has a very significant potential for not just investors who are direct investors, be they private equity or other direct investors, but for institutional investors, the pension funds, the insurance funds, the sovereign wealth funds. There's a very large, there's no lack of money in the global system, in global capital markets. We just need to reduce that risk premium, and that requires the public sector, national governments first and foremost, but critically, the role of the multilaterals. Just one more point. Even in the best of circumstances, even with risk premium having been reduced today, there is an additional challenge because a significant proportion of the technologies required to get to clean energy, green or renewable energies being a dominant form of energy sources for the world, a significant proportion of those investments are either still unproven or they're proven but they don't have the required scale, the scale required to drive down costs. Even for this decade, we still don't have the scale. And scaling up those technologies inherently requires public sector participation because there's upfront capital investment required, there's uncertainty over the trajectory, but there's a bit of a chicken and egg until the public sector gets involved, has large-scale demonstration projects, and subsidizes, well, let me put it another way. Instead of saying subsidizing, I'll say shares in the risk through co-investments and other form of risk mitigation instruments. If the public sector doesn't do it, you really have a problem of the private sector waiting for adequate scale. But we've got to create scale now. So it's a real challenge. Urgency and scale are the two motifs of multilateral and national action now.
Thank you for those opening remarks. Minister Rania, I'm going to take you on a little bit on this implementation. And I think many of the people in the room will be in Sharm el-Sheikh. And you mentioned in your opening speech the guidebook for just finance that you want to focus on also at COP27. A guidebook sounds pretty practical. So what barriers, so maybe just so that people are here privileged to have a little bit of additional time to do the homework, could you talk a little bit about the barriers that you are trying to overcome in the guidebook and maybe also some of the solutions that are suggested? Because a guidebook almost sounds there's a bit of a solution in there, and I'm sure people are anxious to learn a little bit about that.
Well, thank you for that. Yes, we want it to be an operational guide. And when we were asking this question, as Minister Tharman mentioned, you know, what is creating that risk? What is the government as a stakeholder need to do to ensure that it can put in that first capital and it also can entice the private sector to come in? So it needs to create some predictability. What is it that the MDBs need to do to be more forthcoming when it comes to supporting development plans in different countries and taking on that additional risk? What is it that the private sector is asking for? And something else very important, there are so many initiatives. You would be surprised in the same institution that different departments don't know the number of initiatives related to climate, related to, I don't know, the green accelerator for X, the private sector support of Y. So there's just so much that's out there that is not fully known by those who need to use it. So what we wanted to provide within the guidebook is an articulation as much as possible of the options that are available, Number two, highlight what each stakeholder needs to do to make blended finance possible, to try and address the risks that are out there. And then also create a call for action from these different stakeholders. Finally, one important aspect, and we hear this a lot, there is need for scalability, there is need for replicability for success stories that took place. We don't always have to reinvent the wheel. So also the guidebook will provide these examples. Another aspect, and this is what we see in climate finance, and Oliver in his presentation also highlighted that, when you take a look at the percentages of climate finance, they are very much, from the private sector side, biased towards mitigation projects, because the revenue stream is quite clear. If you have a wind project, if you have a solar project, the quantification of your contribution to reducing gas emissions is very clear. So therefore, on your balance sheets, and when the regulator is doing your stress tests, it's very obvious. However, water, food, the technologies that go into it, these are sectors which are very urgent. So going back to the point on urgency, if we don't do anything about them, it becomes very dangerous, and it impedes us from reaching our net zero targets, because agriculture is one of the most polluting sectors, but we cannot live without food. So how can we make adaptation better understood and have metrics which the private sector can say we are also contributing to the reducing gas emissions through adaptation projects. And this is something that we took up during the annual meetings in Davos with the World Economic Forum, where we had private sector participants. And we're trying to put together also a quantification of how adaptation is as important as mitigation, and create a business case for that. So this is, again, what the guidebook as an operational guide is going to present, and the way this is not owned by the Egyptian government or owned by an MDB or owned by the private sector. It's been a consultative process. We have more than 100 partners. It's split up by contributions from everyone. So it's a collective voice. And it has been drafted over several months with very extensive consultations. And as I mentioned in the opening, it will be launched on Finance Day, which is November 9th in Sharm el-Sheikh.
So that will be your homework. Let me just push a little bit more. You moved to water, food, and energy, and you mentioned the Egypt country platform. Now, what is that, and how far is that? Is the private sector truly stepping up in Egypt already? And what would you say are 2 or 3 lessons for other countries that take this on? Because the country platform will be, maybe the first mechanism to get domestic policy right.
A few points to mention, and let me start by climate and development. I think for us to be able to move forward, we should not see climate as one objective, which is very divorced from countries' development trajectories. When at the beginning of 2020, we were 10 years till 2030, when SDGs had to be fulfilled. COVID came, so that created additional gaps towards the SDGs. However, it has to be emphasized once and again that climate action, which is SDG number 13, is one of the 17. So we should not seem as if we are asking countries additional burden, and the public should not feel that there's an extra burden by doing climate action. No, these are intertwined. Development projects or any climate project is a development project at the end of the day. So I think this is a very important precursor. Country platforms were first introduced by the G20 Eminent Persons Group, and Minister Tharman can speak about that being part of it at the time. And the idea of the country platforms were that public finance is there, but again, governments cannot do everything by themselves. So you need to create a proper platform for engagement of your partners. And partners of development include the private sector, both domestic and foreign, include the MDBs that provide the concessionality, include everyone who has action to be done within the country. In our case, in preparation for COP, there was the National Climate Strategy, which was issued in June. It is the 2050 country climate strategy. So it has projects that need to be done across sectors: sustainable transport, green hydrogen, wind, solar, etc. And we also announced our national determined contribution, an update of that. So we said we need to get a subset of these projects and try and see how Egypt can provide an example of a country platform, leveraging on our very strong partnerships with the international community, but also with private sector companies that have already helped in the transition, because we have the biggest solar plant in Aswan, the Bin Ban project, wind farms in the Gulf of Suez, water treatment plants. So we want to continue that. So in July, we launched Egypt's country platform for the Nexus of water, food, and energy. So these projects are a subset of the 2050 climate country strategy. When you take a look at the strategy, at the very beginning, we were very clear in that each and every project is linked to the SDGs. So we wanted to show climate and development come hand in hand. It is completely country-owned, because there's always a perception also that if you're doing climate projects, you're being pushed. You're being pushed by the international community, or you're being pushed by your development, the multilateral development banks, etc. So we wanted to show that this is nationally owned. We are putting climate and development hand in hand. We took a subset of these, which include adaptation, that's where water and food come in, and include mitigation, that's where energy comes in, and it's the decommissioning of 5 gigawatts using gas, and then substituting that by wind and solar in order to be able to export more gas to Europe and also create green hydrogen capacity. So this Nexus of Water, Food and Energy, NWFE, it is a country platform. It's pronounced Nuwafi, as I mentioned, which means fulfilling promises or fulfilling pledges. And what we have done is, for each pillar, the energy pillar, the water pillar, the food pillar, we have a key partner with us. So on energy, it's EBRD, and on food, it's IFAD, on water, it's African Development Bank. And the idea of the platform is to address many of what we've heard in the presentations earlier today: technical capacity, grant component, concessional finance, to crowd in the private sector. So this is what we mean by the country platform. And in September, we had a joint statement with our partners describing the platform. This joint statement was signed by the US, by GFANZ, by many of the multilateral development banks. And we hope by COP28, which is in 12 months, that the full financing package of the NWFI program would be attained. It's $15 billion. In COP27, we will have a partnership agreement and the grant platform, and then take 12 months to ensure that we are doing blended, that we are doing maybe debt swaps with some of our bilateral creditors, and that we also have both concessional as well as grant elements, including philanthropy.
That might have fulfilled all to-dos of Lord Stern, but it's pretty comprehensive. Senior Mr. Tharman, in earlier speeches and discussions, you've talked about the perfect long storm. In my view, that's a one-up on the perfect storm, because the word long got added. I think the perfect storm itself is already a vivid image. And now you push for the investment in a global commons, so this is not just a country-by-country solution. And then you just now talked about the unprecedented scale of this transition. The numbers have been floating today already. But if you think about that scale and the finance and the financial infrastructure that we'll need to not just do this local, but global, which is something you aspire. How do we unlock that? You know, and in a way, are people at the gate to put the money forward, or where is that big bottleneck to get to that scale, in particular also on the global dimension? And do we need new things to solve this? No, it's a big topic.
So I think we have to recognize the complexity of the challenge, the fact that climate, the water crisis, the food crisis, and the biodiversity crisis are interlocking crises. But we've got to recognize it without being overwhelmed by complexity. We need initiatives that are not just addressing one challenge at a time with repercussions for other challenges, which can easily happen, by the way. You can think of ways of solving the climate crisis alone, but which will have major ramifications for water and for biodiversity. For instance, if you just go massively into biofuels, it can have major consequences for biodiversity and for the global water crisis, which then rebound on the climate crisis. Yep. So recognize the complexity, but don't be overwhelmed by it. We need concrete strategies, such as what Dr. Rania was talking about at a country level, the country platforms, that bring people together, and not just bring people together because we need the scale, because we need private finance, we need philanthropic finance, we need all the MDBs involved, not just because of scale, but because there is an interconnection between their investments in a country. There's spillovers from one to another. So when we talk about blended finance, when we talk about public-private partnership, it doesn't mean that every single project requires public and private co-investment. It means the environment as a whole requires greater public investment and greater private investment, but they depend on each other. So a large part of investment in the developing world depends on an enabling environment. A fair amount of it will be just pure private investment, but it requires an enabling environment that national governments, assisted by multilateral players, needs to provide. And that's actually a good part of the broader macro blended finance story. Second, you need the pipelines of projects. Creating more bankable projects through good regulation, sound policy making, and some assurance about the public sector's commitment. There too, the multilaterals can be very helpful. They can be very helpful in providing an anchor in the system, so that it's not just national governments, which after all turn over with, not just in democratic societies, but even in less than democratic societies, there's a turnover of governments. So critical, focus on the enabling environment, focus on the pipeline of projects. And then you come to the financial innovation that Ravi, Joan, Dr. Rania were talking about. There is huge scope for securitization. Not the nasty securitization that people very often associate with, and you read about it in, in the popular media a decade or two ago, but simple, plain vanilla securitization, where it's very clear what the underlying assets are, and you're able to use the public sector and use private investors who can take higher risk to basically get past the initial phase of risk in a project, particularly in the construction phase. And then you securitize, where you're offering an asset class with lower risk to institutional investors who are not typically on the ground in every country, and they don't want too much bespoke investments, company to company, sector by sector. They want simple asset classes to invest in. And securitization allows us to either synthetic securitization or securitization where the underlying assets are themselves invested in by new investors, allows us to recycle capital. And that recycling is critical for us to achieve scale. The MDBs have a balance sheet that needs to be increased through further commitments by member countries, but it's still limited. And you've got to then recycle that capital as much as you can through securitization. And the combination of commercial banks, who can typically take a bit more of the construction risk, institutional investors, is a powerful combination. There is, to repeat, there's no lack of money in the system. We've got $270 trillion in global capital markets. The growth each year in global capital markets is equal to the shortfalls in finance we're talking about for climate mitigation and adaptation globally. There's no lack of money. We just need to provide the right incentive, the right apportionment of risk, and the tools exist. The tools exist both upfront for co-investment and risk mitigation, as well as securitization, so as to recycle public capital and mobilize private capital at scale. But the country platforms are critical because they provide coherence, they bring all the partners together. You know that what the public sector is doing provides assurance to the private sector, and the private sector makes it possible now for us to have not just climate finance because we have a global commons problem, but development finance so that countries can continue to grow and create jobs.
So I think I like this recycling idea because it would take the smaller balance sheets to a bigger one if it only goes to the risk portion of the projects and then it moves around. Apart from the MDBs which you mentioned, in supplying the capital at scale at the global level and at the country level, how do you see the role of philanthropy, but also private financial institutions, whether it's the large asset manager or something? How would they come into the game at the scale required?
Well, and I'm sure Dr. Rania has something to add here. If you look at the pool of global philanthropic money, currently, and I was just reminded about this by Ahmad Said from the ADB, who's I think in the audience and is speaking later today. Barely 2% of it goes into climate-related finance. And John Doerr, who wrote a very good book not long ago, this is John Doerr of Silicon Valley fame, the venture capitalist, saying that we should really aim for about 20%. So not crazy, 20%, not 80%. But 20% is going to make a real difference because philanthropic capital, if you think of it as not just giving grants, not just making good humanitarian gestures, but think of it as capital that can absorb risk through investment. Think of philanthropic capital as catalytic capital. It has that same multiplier effect as the MDBs and as public capital, except that the philanthropies can afford to take more risk. So I think it's potentially very powerful. Too little of it goes into climate-related finance today, and too little of it goes into the emerging world, and barely any of it goes into climate-related finance in the low-income countries. So it's a very good complement to the standard public-private blend to bring in philanthropic capital as capital that can absorb more risk, can have a long-term view, and can be a critical part of the brew.
Ms. Rania, anything to add?
Yes, I totally agree with that. And, the Ministry of International Cooperation works with all development partners, bilateral and multilateral. And one of the ideas, and we've been discussing this in different platforms with philanthropy, be it with the Bezos Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and so forth. When countries are putting together certain projects tapping or knocking on the door of EBRD or EIB or the World Bank or the African Development Bank, in many of these cases, there is a grant element which is required for two reasons. Either to do the feasibility study to make the project bankable, or to create the de-risking so that the private sector can come in with the government and create that PPP. So we need to think of a way to create a platform where the philanthropies can actually access and see what is it that the different countries, be it a climate project, be it a development project, be it water, food project, and have this available by region, by country, so that when they are making their choice, rather than going to a country and just looking for an NGO, which is important and has impact for people, but also, as Minister Tharman mentioned, this idea of catalytic capital to increase investment, and therefore you get a larger multiplier effect, if you will. I think we need to devise ways of being able to tap on the philanthropic money more in a way which is, again, creating these collaborations between the MDBs and them and the private money. I believe that the rhetoric around this and the narrative has been stronger than before. I think that the number of meetings and conventions where they are sitting at the table and listening, and so it's a very important global moment to try and streamline this, and it's with everyone here in the room in different capacities that we will be able to do that.
Thank you. Before I ask a final set of questions to the panel, I think a slide could be popped up that says that at slido.com/TFNZ, the audience can ask some questions. There's a QR code up there also. And then we will get some questions here on stage that I can bring to the panel from the audience. So try to do your multitasking very well. Pay attention to their answers to the next questions, while you also input some questions that we can add to the group. So maybe for both of you, a question. In a way, you could also say this is a bit of a chicken and the egg moment. It's like we're trying to get something going, the ball is rolling, but we want to make the ball much, much bigger. That's the at-scale argument. Let's put this on two sides. One is, let's say the capital comes, the private capital of the PPP. Is the public then ready to put it? So let's say that 900 billion for Asia that Oliver talked about. Here they are. Is the 300 billion there? And is everything there? The other way around, if you feel that the private capital is not yet coming, what are you hearing from the privates when you talk to them that would overcome the chicken and egg from their side? Why are they not? Why is it maybe not yet coming? So maybe you give a perspective. How close to 900 billion are we? And then if it comes, are you ready? And the other way around. I don't know who of you wants to start, but...
The reality is today, there's very little private investment in infrastructure in the developing world outside China. There's really paltry sum that's being invested. And it has to do with what we were discussing earlier. The global capital markets overprice risk in the developing world and overreact to shocks. We're seeing it today, by the way. Consequence of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but consequence critically of the US Fed's necessary moves to raise interest rates. The dollar has strengthened. The combination of higher interest rates and a strengthening dollar is leading to a remarkable exit of bond funds especially, but capital market investments of one form or another from the developing world. Something like 65 billion in just the last 6 months, the first half of the year. So think about that. We are not just not achieving a task of meeting that gap in climate finance, we are moving backwards each time there's a little twitch in global capital markets. Risk turns off. It's not as if there's a calculation of relative yields and exchange rate expectations and so on. It's not even a calculation. They simply switch off. So we have to address that challenge. And when you combine that challenge in the inherent functioning of global capital markets with the scale of financing we need, it really requires a major pivot in the way we operate public sector institutions. Start with the MDBs. To be fair to the MDBs, they are moving. But their shareholders need to pivot. The shareholders need to pivot these institutions towards thinking of themselves not as lenders of first resort, which is what they typically are, but as catalytic finance. If you look today, and again, I'm saying to be fair, they're moving, and they're very keen to move, but their shareholders need to mandate them. If you look today at the World Bank, for instance, which takes this very seriously, the World Bank itself, for every dollar it lends, barely 6 cents is mobilized in private finance. If you take the IFC, which is a market-based institution, it's in the business of mobilizing private finance. It's only about 1 for 1. Every dollar they spend, they mobilize about $1 of private finance. So we're nowhere near the scale of what we require. These are institutions with multiplicative capability. They can be really catalytic. They're very efficient at raising money from the capital markets, first because they're able to leverage. Second, mobilizing finance within the country platforms that Dr. Rania was talking about. Because if they are in the game, if they are providing an anchor in the system, if they're helping to work with policymakers to provide greater stability in policy making, you unleash a lot more private finance, not just in the projects that the MDBs are directly involved in, but in other projects. This is the enabling environment. So we really need a large-scale pivot. And to be fair to the MDBs, it's their shareholders who have to decide on this. Shareholders understand this intellectually, but there's great inertia, a lack of realism on the scale of the challenge we face, and a lack of urgency. I think in this next year, we really need a significant rethink in the role of the MDBs and the regional and national development banks in order to mobilize capital on the scale required and to achieve what Dr. Rania was talking about. Move from these broad commitments to implementation and think about adaptation as well in the developing world, because a large part of the developing world is actually has contributed and is contributing little to carbon emissions, but is suffering the impact of climate change, the extremities of weather and water, and they need support.
It's a very challenging global backdrop, and every day that passes, it's getting a little bit more complicated, as Minister Tharman mentioned, be it from the Fed, be it from the uncertainty about the end of the war and so forth. However, what will distinguish one country from the other is the commitment and the transparency with the policy framework. Because there's so much capital around, it will have to look for opportunities. So if the governments, despite maybe being tight on the public finances, has a good narrative, is committed, shows that it's doing the necessary regulatory reforms or creating the enabling environment for the private sector to come in, I believe that that is a very important initial condition to allow for this capital, for drawing in capital. Now, when it comes to the public finances, institutions such as MIGA, that provides guarantees to private sector companies, becomes very, very important. Of course, how much capital it has and how it can, go into different regions all at the same time, that is again, as was highlighted, for the shareholders to increase that, but it plays a pivotal role when it comes to guarantees. Some of the innovative public finance tools, green bonds, SDG-linked bonds, all of these are being now discussed. We issued a green bond in 2021, the first country in Africa and the Middle East to do that. And it was against green projects in sustainable transport, in water waste management, in wind and solar parks. So it had mitigation, adaptation, and these are projects that had PPPs in them. So, when you take a look at packaging a green bond, it has to be anchored against actual projects that more than once have PPPs at their heart. So the numbers that you mentioned, are the public finances available? It's a tough time for everyone. Nonetheless, you have to provide a convincing story. And to provide a convincing story, this is where country platforms come in. They have to be endorsed from the highest level in the country. You need to be able to push on the different projects. You need to leverage on international partnerships. The concept of collaboration and partnerships is extremely important, and at the heart of these partnerships are the people. Because at the end of the day, any project that you are doing is creating a job, is creating new skills, is addressing a national goal, but at the same time, you are also addressing a global goal. And it's the addition of all the national goals in different countries that we will be able to achieve the global goals.
It sounds to me that on your side, you're ready. It's going to be tough, but and it's in a complicated environment. There's a good audience question, which I think is, in a way, like you're pushing to be ready on the MDB side, on the national side, on the public side, to do all these things. What push are you feeling from the private capital today? Or where should they be pushing to unlock from their side? Because you are on your side as ministers, of course, to do the public side, but you talk to the private side a lot. And I think there's an additional question, what should national banks do, the private banks? But just in general, the private capital, you should maybe use this moment to give an expectation to them rather than just everything that you're doing in creating the readiness. I don't know who you two wants to start, but.
Well, let me make 2 points. First, if we think of development banks, the DFIs, for instance, development financial institutions, these are typically state-owned or partially state-owned. They operate commercially. They're not out to extract short-term profits. They're there for the long term. They're good players. Even the DFIs, even the best of the development banks, today have a hurdle rate for investments in the developing world, in climate-related infrastructure, that is about 12 to 15% at least. Not single digits, it's comfortably in the double digits. These are good players because they have to preserve their capital. They have to ensure that their capital doesn't depreciate over time. Ultimately, they're also accountable to public shareholders. So think about that. How do we reduce that 12 to 15% hurdle rate? It's not because they're over-extracting profits. It's a genuine assessment of risk and the desire for them to preserve their capital. So we've got to collaborate across the global and national public sectors and collaborate across public, private, and philanthropic and organize ourselves better to be able to reduce the risk premium significantly. And we're doing so, by the way, at a time of rising global yields, which is actually growing that problem. Second point I wanted to make, and I'll be saying something that perhaps goes beyond the existing framework of policy making amongst financial regulators and central banks. Central banks take their roles very seriously, and Ravi at the NGFS and all his colleagues are taking their roles very seriously. But the traditional framework today for central bank regulation of financial institutions and financial regulators more broadly, their regulation of financial institutions, banks and capital market players, is based on requiring these financial institutions to recognize the risks to their own balance sheets within some reasonable time horizon, coming out of the possibility of stranded assets and even physical disruption to their clients. And that's a very good start for banks to be able to sort of factor in the risks of climate change on their own balance sheets. But frankly, it's not going to be enough. We are operating in a framework where central banks and financial regulators are independent, and within their strictly independent mandates, that's the most they can do. Regulate financial institutions based on the risk they themselves face, because otherwise There'll be legal challenge, there'll be challenge in places like the US Congress. But we really have to think of central banks and financial regulators as part of public policy. And if you think of them as a agent of public policy more broadly, we know it's not good enough to just talk about the risk to your own balance sheet within a particular horizon. This is a race for our lives. And we need all instruments of public policy to now accelerate action. Even if it's not about risk to your own balance sheet, we need catalytic finance. We need finance to mobilize private finance and private finance to mobilize more private finance. And we have very few instruments. We've got carbon pricing, which Joan spoke about. And even there's great timidity in many countries around the world. They're going for subsidies rather than taxes. Governments will move, but I think they're going to move too slowly. So we have very few instruments. We need to use financial regulators. I'm making a very serious point. As a tool of public policy, the financial regulators are one step removed from the political process, the immediacy of political pressures. They can take a long view, and this is now an instrument of public policy to accelerate action, to mobilize finance, to ensure that finance gets proper risk-adjusted returns for the long term. But if we go purely on the basis of today's frameworks of looking at risks on banks' own balance sheets, it'll get us some distance, but it's not far enough and it's not fast enough. So we have to think more broadly about central banks, not as independent with a capital I, but as part and parcel of the public agency response to motivate, incentivize, and where necessary, penalize private finance so that we redirect private finance for everyone's good, because this is really going to be a win-win.
On the private sector, I just want to go back in our case to 2014, where Egypt issued its integrated sustainable energy strategy, and that was to change the energy mix and the dependence on renewable and including solar and wind. And in order to do that, the feed-in tariff for private sector had to change, and that's where finance was mobilized from different DFIs and MDBs for the private sector. Today, when you say, is the private sector there, does it want to come in? It's seeing opportunities in water desalination, which is extremely important. The government is going to be the customer for the private sector. So yes, they are standing there and they want to, to come in, and that's why I said when you have the political commitment and a clear framework, you will be able to entice them to come in. Green hydrogen is coming in a very big way, and the source of it is the renewable energy. So it's good that you've started early. You've had a track record with the private sector companies. So what I'm trying to say is there are bright spots, and there is an opportunity within this very gloomy global picture. But as I mentioned, governments have to be extremely serious, and the call for action from MDBs, from philanthropy, what we're doing in terms of trying to mobilize the stakeholders is important. But we do see a lot of interest from the private sector, and this is what we're trying to leverage on and push ahead.
Fantastic. I'm going to give you one closing question from the audience, which I think is very close to the implementation objective of COP27. I'm going to prime you a little bit. So the OECD has done some fantastic analysis. This is European, but it's actually true for the world too. That says that 75% of firms can reduce their scope 1 and 2 for $5 a ton. That's only 25% of the emissions, but it is 25% of the emissions. And of course, the other 75% of emissions are more at the $170 to $200 a ton, which is the hard stuff. And then there's some methane stuff that could be easier than the hard stuff too. Is there a bridge? And the question in the audience is, what is the next step that you would like 23 to do? Like, what's our first unit of progress in the topic that we've discussed? But why I primed you with there's some easy stuff. Could we start with the easy stuff in the next step, or do we need to actually start at the hard stuff in our first step? So for you both, a next step for 23, do it with a punch and short, so that the audience has a pragmatic next step. Right?
I think to achieve our medium-term objectives, we need some positive stories in the short term, and we need to scale them up quickly. If we want to motivate governments and motivate populations to accept a steeper curve in carbon pricing globally, which we're very far away from globally, the necessary curve in carbon pricing. You need to show that this is not at the expense of jobs, it's not at the expense of growth in the developing world especially. So what's critical is to move ahead on implementation and create real momentum along the lines that Dr. Rania was talking about and the Egyptian country platform. It's really critical because at the end of the day, this is a political economy situation. It's not pure economics. It's not pure politics either, because if you get the economics wrong, the politics is a disaster. It's a political economy problem, but you've got to motivate people to know that this is not about some global problem and I am the one who's having to suffer. We will all suffer everywhere in the world if we don't move, but there's also some benefit. There is, as Joan and others were talking about, there are new jobs to be created. There's innovation potential. Nick Stern spoke about this as well. Tremendous potential in a new model of development, model of development that increasingly moves along that transition path, cleaner energies, not from day one, but you can move towards it. But critically, there's a huge growth opportunity here. Huge growth opportunity. So create that positive story, mandate our institutions the right way, regulate them the right way, and I think we can get more buy-in over time.
By 2023, November 23, I want the full package of NOAFI to be fulfilled in terms of financing, but I think the agenda we have is clear. I think what every stakeholder needs to do is resonates more. The point the minister made about climate and development being hand in hand, we have to keep on hammering this very much. And in the narrative from different institutions, that has to come more forcefully. Because over the past period, it has been seen as an additional burden on the public, additional burden on the public finances. What we're trying to say is, no, we cannot escape it. Today, if you need to access finance from anywhere, including the capital markets, there has to be some green in it. So why not make it, and clarify that that is part of the development process, so that we are all winners and seen as gaining from it. So I think that is extremely important. Country ownership is important. Communication is important. Being forthcoming with the data as well as important, and how short we are in terms of financing with the commitments is important, because we are very, very much short. And one last thing related to COP, when we talk about loss and damage and when we talk about adaptation, according to Copenhagen and the Paris Agreement, all of this should have been financed through grants, which is not the case. So this is also going to be a big discussion during COP27. Thank you.
So I took away, let us all be winners, and I would like to thank the two ministers for giving us perspective and confidence. Thank you.